Let's talk about one of the most explosive decades in all of American history, the 1850s. This was a time when a whole series of cultural, political, and legal shocks just completely shattered a really fragile peace and set the United States on a path to civil war that, looking back, feels almost irreversible. There's this famous quote, supposedly from Abraham Lincoln to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, whether he actually said it or not, it gets at a really profound truth. The fights of the 1850s weren't just happening in Congress or out on the frontier. They were being fought in the hearts and minds of everyday Americans, and they were often ignited by powerful, world-changing ideas. So that's really the big question we're tackling here. How did all the compromises that held the nation together for decades just suddenly fall apart? We're going to look at the key events of the 1850s like a series of falling dominoes, where each one pushes the country a little closer to the edge. So let's get into it and tip over that first one. Okay, so our first domino, it wasn't a law, it wasn't a battle, it was a book. This thing was a cultural firestorm that turned a political debate about slavery into a deeply personal moral crusade for millions and millions of people. So in 1852, a writer and mother named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was just heartbroken by the injustice of slavery, wrote this novel that gave the institution a human face. It actually started out as a series in an anti-slavery newspaper, but when it was published as a book, it created an absolute sensation like nothing the country had ever seen before. And when I say sensation, I mean it. The sheer scale of its impact is just hard to wrap your head around today. In its very first year, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in the United States alone. To give you some perspective on that, the only book that had sold more in the entire 19th century was the Bible. This wasn't just a bestseller, it was a full-blown national event. And that event basically split the country right in two. In the North, people saw the novel as this shocking, truthful exposé of slavery's horrors. It made an abstract issue feel incredibly real and urgent. But in the South, oh man, it was condemned as a vicious slander, a complete lie written by some meddling Northern woman who had no clue about their way of life. So what drove her to write it? Well, Stowe herself said she was motivated in part by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was a really controversial law that made it a federal crime to help escape slaves, even if you were in a free state. That meant Northerners were now legally forced to participate in the system of slavery. For Stowe, and for many others, this wasn't just political anymore. It was a profound moral crisis. So, after the cultural shockwave of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the conflict really moved from the page out onto the frontier. A political plan that was supposed to create compromise ended up causing literal bloodshed. The big idea at the center of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act was this thing called popular sovereignty. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty democratic, right? Just let the settlers in new territories vote for themselves on whether to allow slavery. The hope in Washington was that this would take the explosive issue off their hands and kind of quiet the whole debate. Yeah, it did the exact opposite. Here's the catch. To even allow that vote to happen, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had to completely get rid of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That was a deal that had kept the peace for over 30 years by banning slavery in that exact territory. Tossing aside this long-standing agreement was like setting off a political earthquake. It just shattered the trust between North and South and ripped open a national wound that had been closed for a whole generation. And the results was total chaos. I mean, neither side was just going to sit back and hope the vote went their way. Pro-slavery folks called border ruffians came pouring in from Missouri, and anti-slavery free staters rushed in from the North. What followed were fraudulent elections, two rival governments, and eventually widespread violence. The territory quickly earned a grim new nickname, Bleeding Kansas. And this wasn't some abstract political fight. It was deeply personal and tragic. This quote here is from a letter by a woman named Senine Campbell. She was the fiancée of a pro-slavery man who was killed in the fighting. It's just a heartbreaking reminder that, for people on both sides, the violence in Bleeding Kansas destroyed real lives and real futures. So, if Bleeding Kansas was the political system failing on the ground, our next domino was the legal system pouring gasoline on the fire from the nation's highest court. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 was a legal bombshell that just destroyed any last hope for a political compromise. So, who was Dred Scott? He was an enslaved man whose owner had taken him to live in free states and territories for a time. He sued for his freedom,
arguing that because he had lived on free soil, he had become a free man. The case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided to issue a massive and truly devastating ruling.
The court's decision basically had 3 knockout punches. First, it ruled that African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court, period. Second, it declared the Missouri Compromise, that old deal from 1820, was unconstitutional, saying Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. And third, it said that slaves were property protected by the Constitution, which meant they could be taken anywhere. And this infamous line from Chief Justice Taney's majority opinion, it just summed up the whole shocking moral and legal basis of the ruling. For anyone who opposed slavery, this decision was terrifying proof that the federal government was now completely controlled by pro-slavery forces. It felt like the game was rigged and that no compromise was even possible anymore. Now, these events, the book, the bloodshed, the court case, they didn't just happen in a vacuum. They were hardening 2 completely opposing worldviews until they became, well, irreconcilable. A clash was starting to seem not just possible, but absolutely inevitable. By the end of the 1850s, the 2 parts of the country were viewing each other through this lens of just deep, deep suspicion. In the North, the fear of a slave power conspiracy really took hold. And in the South, the defense of their way of life was all centered on the idea of states' rights. It's so important to understand what both sides really meant by these phrases. So, the slave power was this northern belief that a small, secret group of wealthy slave owners had basically seized control of everything: the presidency, Congress, and especially the Supreme Court. To them, things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision were just Exhibit A and B, that this group was systematically trying to expand slavery across the entire nation, which they saw as a threat to the liberty of all white Americans. The Southern counter-argument was built on this idea of states' rights, which they traced all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. Their logic went like this. The United States was a voluntary compact of states. Therefore, any state had the right to nullify a federal law they didn't like. And, as a last resort, they had the right to just secede from the Union entirely to protect their interests. And let's be clear, the number one interest they were trying to protect was the institution of slavery. After this whole decade of escalating crises, the election of 1860 was the final domino to fall. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency as the candidate for the brand new anti-slavery Republican Party, the South saw it as a full-blown existential threat. To them, a government that was committed to stopping the spread of slavery was a government that would eventually try to destroy it completely. And so, they seceded. And that really leaves us with one final big question. When you look back at the cultural chasm created by a book, the real violence in Kansas, the absolute no-compromise nature of the Dred Scott decision, and these 2 ideologies that just could not coexist, it's really hard not to see the war as inevitable. So what do you think? Was there any off-ramp left on this tragic road to war?